The obsidian spire of the Grand Synod pierced the cerulean veil of Xylo's prime, a monument to 10 millennia of unified governance. And within its heart, the silence was a physical weight, pressing upon the assembled delegates of the concordance. The crystalline matrices projecting the holographic map of the charted spiral arm pulsed with a faint, troubling ochre light, centered precisely upon the designation the cartographers had nervously affixed to the encroaching anomaly. Sol III. Generations of strategic doctrine, predicated on the predictable geometries of expansion and entropy, shuddered under the weight of this single, unresolved variable. Elder Cathar of the Krill hegemony, his chitinous exoskeleton shimmering with the stress-induced violet hue of profound agitation, shifted his bulk upon the sculpted dais, the minute grinding of his mandibles the only sound daring to break the oppressive quiet. His multifaceted eyes, usually capable of perceiving the subtle shifts in the quantum foam that defined their spatial navigation, were fixed solely on the cold, hard data streaming from the nearest sensor perimeter. Data that refused to reconcile with established axioms of interstellar aggression. They had expected swift capitulation, perhaps a frantic plea for terms once the preliminary kinetic exchange concluded, the customary response from any species exhibiting rudimentary fission capability. Instead, there was only silence, an absolute deafening void where the expected cries of terror or demands for negotiation should have resonated across the subspace channels. The human vessel, designated by the Krill as merely the intruder, remained stubbornly stationary, a single, impossibly dense point of defiance against the aggregated might of the Concordance's border defense armadas. Armadas that collectively possessed the capacity to scour entire nascent civilizations from their planetary cradles with minimal exertion. Vizier Lyra of the Cygnian Directorate, whose species prided itself on cerebral detachment and the flawless execution of probabilistic calculus, tilted her elongated head, the silvery filaments adorning her crest momentarily dimming as she accessed the latest threat assessment metrics. Her internal processing rate, usually humming at optimal efficiency, was spiking erratically, a manifestation of deep systemic confusion. The energy signature emanating from the designated vessel defies classification, High Elder, she articulated, her voice a smooth, synthesized ripple that carried no inflection of panic, yet contained the razor edge of pure intellectual distress. It is not a weapon discharge, nor is it a standard propulsion field utilizing any known manifold of spacetime manipulation. It registers as stasis, a complete, perfect nullification of localized entropy gradients, focused outward. It is a perfect barrier, Cathar. Our most sophisticated particle beams, those designed to disassemble molecular bonds at vast range, simply cease to exist upon intersection with its forward arc. They do not scatter, they do not reflect, they simply stop. The implications hung heavy in the pressurized atmosphere of the Synod. If the fundamental laws of physics, as codified by millennia of concordance observation, could be so casually negated by a single, relatively small craft originating from a dust-choked world deemed classy in developmental potential, then their entire cosmological understanding was flawed, built upon a foundation of ignorance regarding the inhabitants of Sol III. The arrogance that had characterized their initial response, a swift, dismissive quarantine followed by the deployment of a punitive vanguard fleet, now tasted like ash on the collective palate of the Concordance hierarchy. Thraxus of the Vrel Ascendancy, representative of the purely martial wing of the Alliance, slammed a fist, a segmented appendage capable of crushing ferroceramic alloys, onto the polished floor. The impact reverberated through the chamber, a physical punctuation mark to his barely contained fury. Silence the mathematicians and the philosophers. We possess the means to erase the planet from which this aberration originates. A single synchronized kinetic strike, coordinated across the primary orbital axes, would render the surface uninhabitable for the next 100,000 cycles. Their persistence is an insult to the very concept of dominance. We have observed their crude broadcasts, their internal conflicts, their self-destructive tendencies. They are a species that willingly poisons its own atmosphere for the sake of ephemeral economic gain. Why are we debating the properties of their shields when we possess the means to extinguish the source? His voice, deep and resonant, carried the unquestioned authority of species whose history was written in the subjugation of lesser entities. Yet even Thraxus, the embodiment of brute force, paused, the data stream overriding his aggressive impulse. The human plah. Net, though undeniably primitive in many respects, remained untouched, pristine, because the intruder had made it clear, through its very existence, that any generalized retaliatory strike would be met not with defensive measures, but with an unknown, and therefore infinitely more terrifying, counter-response. The delegation from the sentient gaseous entities of the nebulaic drift, represented only by a fluctuating cloud of highly pressurized bioluminescent particles contained within a massive containment field, shifted its internal structure, emitting a slow, rhythmic pattern of emerald light, their equivalent of thoughtful contemplation mixed with profound concern. Their emissary designated Whisper of the Void, communicated through complex resonant frequencies channeled directly into the Synod's translation matrix. The Vrelian instinct for annihilation is predictable, Thraxis, but it is also the reason for our continued survival across the millennia. Annihilation is the ultimate certainty. The humans offer no certainty. Their response matrix is not reactive, it is inert. They have not fired a single weapon nor sent a single demand. They simply are. This lack of predictable desperation is what frightens the collective psyche. They do not fight as we understand fighting. They simply withstand, and in that perfect, unwavering resistance, they imply a superiority we cannot yet quantify. We must understand the architecture of their restraint. Elder Cethar nodded, the movement barely perceptible but deeply significant. He addressed the assembly, his voice grave, stripped of its earlier frustration, replaced by the cold, clinical necessity of high strategy. The Krill hegemony is aligned with the drift's analysis. Aggression in this singular instance is mathematically unsound. We have initiated communications via all known frequency spectra, utilizing mathematically universal constants and prime number sequences as introductory greetings. We have received no direct audio or visual response, only one transmission. A data packet, encrypted beyond the comprehension of even our most dedicated cryptographers, yet it required no decoding. It simply opened upon reception by all active command consoles within the perimeter fleets. It was a statement, not a message. He activated the Synod's primary projection field, overlaying the sensor schematic with the singular data artifact they had managed to parse, not by cracking the code, but by observing its internal resonance pattern. It was not language. It was a perfectly structured, self-referencing mathematical proof, demonstrating the absolute certainty of two intersecting probabilities resolving into a single, unavoidable outcome. "What did it prove, Elder?" Lyra inquired, her filaments flickering with renewed intensity. "It proved," Cethar stated, the silence returning, heavier now, enriched with philosophical dread, "that the moment we committed our initial punitive fleet to the outer boundary of their solar system, the projected probability of that fleet surviving the next Sol cycle dropped to zero, not through hostile action, merely through the consequence of their presence. It implies an understanding of causality, of cosmic interaction, that renders our understanding of localized spacetime manipulation laughably simplistic. They are not defying our physics. They are operating on a physics we have not yet discovered, and they are allowing us to perceive the edge of that reality only enough to understand our own precarious position." Thraxis bristled, his Vrelian pride wounded by the implicit suggestion of martial inadequacy. "Then we will present them with a direct challenge. Send a single diplomatic envoy, escorted by a full squadron, but mandate that the escort remains outside the defined planetary exclusion zone. We will force a parley. We will observe their biological structure, their societal organization. We will treat them as a new, albeit perplexing, entity within the established political firmament, but we will treat them as a subordinate entity nonetheless." The sheer, ingrained belief in the hierarchy of the galaxy, the concordance standing immutable above all, was the bedrock of their civilization. To treat any emergent species as an equal was an existential threat to their very governance structure. The debate raged for 3 standard cycles within the Synod, a tempest of conflicting philosophies, strategic necessities, and existential terror masked by impeccable diplomatic protocol. The Krill sought understanding through patience, the Cygnian Directorate demanded quantifiable data before commitment, and the Vrel demanded immediate, demonstrable assertion of superiority. Finally, a compromise was brokered, one dictated entirely by the unwavering stillness of the human vessel. A single, unescorted diplomatic probe, utilizing only non-aggressive sensory equipment, would approach the void ship. The decision was ratified with the collective rel. Reluctant assent of the assembled great houses. If humanity responded with violence to this minimal gesture, the Vrel argument for immediate sterilization would gain insurmountable traction. If they responded with diplomacy, the concordance would gain the intelligence necessary to categorize and eventually control them. The probe, a small, sleek vessel bearing the carefully calibrated symbolic representation of the concordance's non-aggression pacts, a stylized helix of interwoven light, accelerated slowly toward the anomaly. Its journey across the void was agonizingly slow, punctuated only by the ceaseless monitoring of the krill sensor arrays. As it neared the invisible boundary of the human vessel's null field, the probe's internal systems registered an almost immediate degradation in operational capacity. The navigational gyros began to stutter, the quantum entanglement communications array dissolved into static, and the life support indicators flashed warnings indicating fluctuations in ambient energy density that should have been impossible in the vacuum of space. Then the expected happened, yet it unfolded with a calm finality that shattered the projections of every delegate watching from Xylos Prime. The human vessel did not fire upon the probe. It did not repel it violently. Instead, a section of the impossibly smooth, matte black hull, previously indistinguishable from the rest of the structure, dilated with mechanical precision that suggested perfect engineering tolerances. It was not an airlock. It was a precisely shaped aperture, perfectly dimensioned to accept the diplomatic probe entirely. The probe, responding to internal automated directives programmed to avoid kinetic trauma, sailed smoothly into the opening, its exterior sensors feeding back a torrent of information that overloaded the external receivers of the observing krill ships before the aperture sealed behind it without a tremor, without a splash of displaced stellar dust. Silence returned to the synod, deeper and more profound than before. Lyra's filaments were vibrating at a frequency that bordered on painful resonance. They welcomed it, she whispered, the synthesized tone strained. They did not demand it be powered down, they did not destroy its offensive potential, they simply brought it inside their immediate envelope. This suggests absolute confidence in their own defensive architecture, or a complete misunderstanding of diplomatic procedure, which seems unlikely given the complexity of their defense. Elder Cethar leaned forward, resting his elongated limbs upon the edge of the dais. We wait. We have gambled our strategic posture on observing their behavior within their defined domain. The psychological assessment team estimated that a species possessing this level of technological isolation would exhibit either immediate hostility born of xenophobia or crippling fear when confronted with such overwhelming, silent power. We must observe which human trait manifests. Hours bled into cycles within the synod, time warped by the intensity of their anticipation. The probe transmitted no data, as the internal environment of the black ship was utterly shielded from external probing. The concordance could only watch the external indicators, the minimal energy fluctuations, the perfect thermal stability, and wrestle with the philosophical implications of this silent encounter. Then, after a duration that felt epical to the gathered delegates, a signal returned. It was not a complex data packet, nor a coded warning. It was a single, clear, high-fidelity audio transmission, broadcast on a frequency that matched the universal standard for direct, unencrypted voice communication, a gesture of astonishing, almost reckless openness. The voice that emerged into the great hall, channeled through the translation matrix, was profoundly unexpected. It was not the harsh, guttural sound theorized by the Vrelian xenolinguists, nor the complex multitonal resonance suggested by the Cygnian probabilistic models. It was a voice of remarkable clarity, mid-range, possessing an even, measured cadence that conveyed neither aggression nor submission, but a kind of profound, almost weary professionalism. This is Envoy Commander Eva Rostova of the Sol Defense Initiative. We acknowledge receipt of your diplomatic overture. We have secured your probe for analysis and stabilization. We request immediate, secure bandwidth for a bilateral discussion concerning your strategic boundaries. We must emphasize with complete clarity that any further escalation of force against this vessel, or any asset within this designated sector, will be interpreted as a declaration of total, unmitigated conflict. We are prepared to defend our interests. We await your response. The simplicity of the declaration was more jarring than any display of overwhelming power. It was direct, ethical in its clarity, and utterly devoid of the posturing and complex ritual that characterized concordance diplomacy. It was the language of individuals who dealt in verifiable reality, not probabilistic threat assessment. Thraxus roared in frustration, his segmented fingers clenching the floor so tightly that hairline fractures spider-webbed across the obsidian. Unmitigated conflict. They threaten the concordance with the consequences of their own actions. This is the arrogance of the truly unevolved. Lyra silenced him with a subtle gesture of her hand, her attention riveted to the projected representation of the human envoy's brief statement. Thraxus, observe the language. We are prepared to defend our interests. Not, we will annihilate you. Not, we demand tribute. But a simple statement of capability balanced against a clear statement of intent. They do not seek dominion, they seek stability within a defined sphere. This suggests a pragmatic, almost mercantile approach to interstellar relations, which is far more dangerous than raw aggression. Elder Cethar addressed the void. Prepare the primary diplomatic channel. We will respond in kind. We will send the most skilled negotiator the hegemony possesses. We will ascertain the nature of the power that allows them to remain utterly motionless against the aggregated force of the galaxy. The die was cast. Humanity had stated its position with unsettling calmness, and the concordance, for the first time in its long history, found itself compelled to negotiate from a position of genuine uncertainty, forced to confront a species whose strength lay not in expansion, but in its terrifying capacity for perfect defense. The primary diplomatic transfer chamber aboard the Krill flagship, the axiom of precedence, was designed to inspire awe and enforce the psychological asymmetry inherent in concordance negotiations. The architecture favored soaring arches, vast empty spaces, and lighting calibrated to subtly enhance the imposing stature of the Krill hosts while casting the expected, often nervous, visiting envoys into slightly reduced visual prominence. Today, however, the usual atmosphere of calculated dominance was disrupted by an almost palpable tension. The human envoy, Commander Eva Rostova, stood alone on the central receiving platform, a solitary figure framed against the polished, reflective floor that stretched away into the architectural shadows. She wore a uniform of muted gray and black, entirely devoid of overt ornamentation or visible weaponry, a stark contrast to the elaborate, layered regalia of the Krill High Council representatives arrayed behind Elder Cethar. Rostova was unremarkable in build, possessing the soft, often perplexing musculature associated with Sol III bipedal life, but her bearing was what arrested the attention of the observers. She stood with an ease that bordered on languor, yet her eyes, large, dark apertures that seemed to absorb the light rather than reflect it, missed nothing. She did not fidget, did not attempt to scan the room, nor did she engage in the subtle power plays of body language endemic to interstellar diplomacy. She simply waited, an island of unflustered stillness in a sea of ancient, structured power. Elder Cethar initiated the proceedings, his voice modulated to its most authoritative register, though the subtle tremor of uncertainty persisted beneath the surface frequency. Envoy Rostova of Sol III, we recognize your presence and accept your designation as the representative of your governing body. State the full parameters of the Sol Defense Initiative's established territory, and articulate the specific reasoning behind the preemptive interdiction of concordance exploratory vessels within the Kepler system. Rostova's response was immediate, flowing from her lips in perfect, synthesized Krillian dialect, the pronunciation subtly different, almost too clean, lacking the inherent guttural stops common to native speakers. Elder Cethar, the parameters of the Sol Defense Initiative are simple. The boundary is defined by the event horizon of observable non-hostile influence. We claim no territory beyond what we actively inhabit, monitor, or rely upon for critical resource stability. The Kepler system was interdicted because your exploratory vessels, utilizing high-yield spatial folding techniques, were generating temporal anomalies that directly interfered with the stability of a classified, long-term observation array maintained by Earth intelligence. That array is fundamental to our species' primary understanding of cosmic background radiation. Its compromise is deemed an existential threat. The Krill delegates exchanged subtle internal transmissions, a cascade of confusion, temporal anomalies, a classified observation array. This sounded like the concerns of a species dedicated to theoretical physics, not one that had previously demonstrated only rudimentary capacity for planetary warfare. Thraxus, unable to contain his skepticism, stepped forward, his armored form casting a massive shadow over the human envoy. Existence is defined by demonstrable physical presence and resource control. Human, You speak of observation arrays as if they hold the keys to sovereignty. We have observed your species for centuries. You pollute your homeworld, engage in petty internecine struggles, and prioritize ephemeral concepts over material security. Yet now you claim cosmic custodianship based on undetectable instruments. Explain this disparity in your species' priorities. Rostova turned her attention to Thraxus, her expression unchanging, betraying no awareness of the physical threat his proximity implied. She addressed him directly, her tone shifting slightly, gaining a precise, almost pedagogical coolness. Warlord Thraxus, your assessment of humanity is accurate, historically speaking. We were, and in many pockets still are, deeply flawed. Our history is a continuous, agonizing struggle against our own instinctual limitations. However, the Sol Defense Initiative represents the unified, distilled conclusion of that history. We learned, through catastrophic, self-inflicted events, that physical dominion over inert matter is secondary to understanding the underlying, unifying principles of reality. Your concordance measures power in cubic light-years controlled and kinetic yield. We measure it in verified understanding of the underlying framework. She paused, allowing the alien concepts to settle. The array you reference is designed to map the informational decay rate of the early universe, the decay of causality itself. If that decay rate is disrupted, the entire mathematical scaffolding upon which your warp drives, your communications, and indeed, the very structural integrity of your localized space relies, becomes unstable. We intervene not to seize territory, but to prevent the accidental, ignorant erasure of established physical constants across this sector. We do not seek to rule your territory, Warlord. We seek only to ensure that reality remains fundamentally consistent enough for us both to continue to exist. This was the first major reveal. Humanity was not interested in conquest or resources, but in the preservation of universal structure, viewing the Concordance fleets as sources of dangerous, chaotic interference. Vizier Lyra, sensing the profound shift in the negotiations axis, stepped forward, her silver filaments shimmering with thoughtful analysis. Envoy Rostova, the Signian Directorate values verifiable data above all else. Your defense of Kepler suggests a superior grasp of spatial mechanics than our own models currently afford us. If your assertion regarding the temporal disruption is accurate, then your technology and your understanding is vastly superior to anything catalogued by the Concordance. If you possess this level of comprehension, why did you not announce your presence earlier? Why wait until we deployed a punitive fleet before establishing contact? Rostova offered the closest thing to a genuine human expression, a faint upturning of the corners of her mouth, a subtle acknowledgement of a difficult truth. Vizier Lyra, humanity is not inherently benevolent. We are survivors. For centuries, we watched the galaxy from a position of isolation, a necessity born of our own internal instability. We perfected our understanding in silence. We established the SDI only when our observational data indicated that the aggressive expansion patterns of the Concordance were beginning to impinge upon the fundamental stability of the local void. Your method of travel, your kinetic barrages, they create noise in the universal signal. We delayed contact because we had to be certain that we could deliver the warning without becoming part of the problem. We did not wish to appear as another ambitious empire demanding borders. We wish to appear as the necessary custodians of the stability you all take for granted. Cthar finally spoke again, his voice softer now, laced with the respect born of true intellectual confrontation. You speak of defense, yet you possess a technology capable of effortless projection across vast distances, technology that renders our accumulated armaments irrelevant. If you are merely custodians, why the deliberate ambiguity? Why not simply broadcast this information, the need for stability, before the first ship was launched? Because, Rostova replied, the word hanging in the vast chamber like a judgment, understanding is not transmission. You, elders, speak of philosophy and logic, but you are constrained by the architecture of your own power structure. The Krill hegemony requires dominance to justify its existence. The Vrel ascendancy requires conflict to maintain social cohesion. The Signian Directorate requires complex variables to maintain its intellectual superiority. To present such a profound truth to a political body built upon its negation would have been perceived as an act of war, or a lie designed for manip. Ulation, we had to demonstrate the reality of our position through action, or in our case, through absolute, unwavering inaction in the face of overwhelming threat. The tension shifted from fear of annihilation to the fear of irrelevance. The Concordance was not being threatened by a superior military force. It was being confronted by a superior epistemology. The bilateral discussion transitioned from confrontation to the slow, arduous process of information exchange, a process that unfolded over several tense rotational periods within the sterile confines of the human vessel, the Steadfast, which had been carefully moved to a neutral staging orbit far from any contested system. The Krill sent an entire contingent of their most renowned xenolinguists, temporal physicists, and strategic analysts, a phalanx of specialized intellects tasked with deconstructing the human presence. They were led by High Analyst Cathren, a Krill known for his ruthless dissection of any illogical premise. The interior of the Steadfast was the antithesis of Concordance design. There were no sweeping vistas, no vast, intimidating halls. The human ship was functional, almost Spartan in its design philosophy, prioritizing efficiency and the preservation of the internal crew environment above all else. Surfaces were matte, designed to minimize reflective glare, and the air carried a distinct, faint odor of processed organic matter and clean ozone, the subtle markers of human habitation. The Krill delegates, used to environments shaped by millennia of established aesthetic dogma, felt unnerved by the sheer practicality of the design. It suggested a species that had discarded superfluous form in favor of absolute function, a concept alien to the political necessities of the Concordance empires. Cathren, utilizing a custom-fabricated environmental suit that maintained the necessary atmospheric pressure and gaseous composition for his own physiology, focused his attention on Commander Rostova, who now occupied the role of lead liaison, accompanied by a single, silent human specialist, identified only as Technician Jax. "Commander," Cathren began, his synthesized voice clipped impatient, "we have analyzed the core energy signature you utilize. It is not antimatter reaction, nor is it zero-point extraction. It is a controlled resonance cascade that appears to manipulate the fundamental weak nuclear force, essentially allowing you to borrow energy from the localized space-time curvature without inducing instability. How is this shielded? Our best simulations indicate that drawing that magnitude of energy should tear the hull apart through sympathetic vibrational collapse." Rostova gestured toward Technician Jax, who stepped forward, exhibiting none of the Krillian analyst's profound sense of self-importance. Jax held a small, dull metallic object, a data slate, the Krill surmised, which projected a complex three-dimensional schematic onto the intervening space. "Warlord Cathren," Jax stated, his voice slightly higher-pitched than Rostova's but equally calm, "the shield is not a defense against the energy, it is the conduit for the energy. The vessel is not built of traditional alloys. It is a self-assembling metamaterial matrix grown around a stabilized quantum entanglement core. The weak force manipulation doesn't create stress, it generates harmonic resonance. The material of the hull is designed to vibrate in perfect counterphase to the energy draw, achieving a state of total systemic equilibrium. Think of it as a musical instrument. You can play a string loudly, but if the body of the instrument is designed to absorb and redirect the sympathetic vibrations perfectly, the instrument itself remains unharmed." Cathren stared at the schematic, his multifaceted eyes trying to process the concept of materials science that treated physical structure as a reactive acoustic dampener. This implies a complete mastery over the interaction between matter and energy at the subquark level. This capability should have been impossible for a species only recently achieving stable interstellar transit. What resource did you exploit to achieve this level of mastery so rapidly? Rostova answered this time, her expression taking on a shadow of deep, complex sorrow that the Krill found difficult to categorize. "We exploited time, analyst, and failure. When we first achieved rudimentary fusion capability, we did not look outward, we looked inward. Our species very nearly destroyed itself multiple times through the very technologies we developed: nuclear proliferation, ecological collapse driven by unregulated industrial scaling, self-inflicted biological catastrophes. We spent nearly 3 centuries in a state of acute, species-wide existential crisis. That crisis was the crucible. Necessity, driven by the clear and present danger of our own extinction, forced us to develop principles of sustainable energy and absolute defensive integrity B. For we were allowed to expand further. We did not achieve this power by conquering others. We achieved it by mastering the necessary principles for our own continued survival in the face of self-destruction. We learned that true power is the ability to stop the inevitable decay. This revelation, that humanity's greatest technological leaps were born from self-imposed, near-catastrophic survival rather than external conflict, deeply unsettled the Krill analytical team. Their own culture valued expansion and the crushing of internal dissent in the name of unified progress. Human progress seemed born of internal, brutal self-correction. Lyra, whose Cygnian directorate specialized in information warfare and cultural mapping, focused on the political implications. Commander, if your species possesses this capability, why maintain such a minimal profile? Why not join the galactic discourse, offer your stability protocols, and gain commensurate influence within the established order? Rostova leaned back slightly, a gesture of relaxation that felt deeply alienating to the anxious Krill observers. Because Vizier Lyra, the established order is predicated on a misunderstanding of cosmic scale. Your concordance is a vast, powerful entity, yes, but you are fundamentally limited by your own definition of power. You measure success by growth. We measure success by entropy management. We observed your history, your treaties, your wars, your political maneuvers. They are all exercises in optimizing resource allocation within a closed system. We do not operate within a closed system. We operate on the fundamental constants. To engage politically would require us to compromise those constants to fit your immediate needs, which would, in turn, compromise our ultimate goal, universal stability. She looked directly at Cthar, her gaze unwavering. Elder, your civilization spans thousands of systems, yet you are still vulnerable to a single, strategically placed disruption in your primary hyperlane conduits. Your reliance on localized spatial geometry makes you brittle. We are not interested in replacing the concordance. We are interested in ensuring that the mathematics of your existence do not accidentally destabilize the mathematics of ours. The conversation reached an impasse of philosophical divergence. The concordance understood power as application. Humanity presented power as principle. The climax of this stage of dialogue arrived when Catherine pushed for the ultimate assurance. Commander, your assertions regarding the necessary stability of causality are extraordinary. If you truly possess the understanding to guarantee the integrity of spacetime, you must demonstrate this to the satisfaction of the Concordance Council. We require tangible proof that your existence does not pose a greater, latent threat than the conflict you claim to avert. Prove the ethical dimension of your power. Rostova nodded slowly, a signal that seemed to carry the weight of heavy responsibility. We anticipated this requirement. Technician Jax, if you please. Jax brought up a new schematic on the projection field. It was not a diagram of a human ship or an energy conduit. It was a map of the void, spanning several thousand light years, centered on a location the Krill had designated the Great Silence, a region where all conventional sensor data invariably failed, a region the Concordance considered either a natural spatial anomaly or a relic of a long-vanished, incomprehensibly powerful predecessor race. For 3 centuries, Rostova explained, her voice dropping to a near whisper that nonetheless filled the chamber, we have been monitoring a signal emanating from the Great Silence. It is not a broadcast. It is a decay signature, a pattern indicating that something massive, ancient, and fundamentally unnatural is collapsing within that region. Our simulations indicate that this collapse, when it reaches critical mass, will not merely destroy the region. It will introduce a catastrophic, self-propagating entropic cascade that will propagate outward at superluminal velocity, unraveling causality sector by sector. The Concordance has dismissed this area as irrelevant, too distant, or too complex to map. We recognized it for what it is, the inevitable failure point of an ancient, flawed cosmic mechanism. The Krill analysts recoiled, their sensor readings confirming the impossible. Deep in the Great Silence, a signature that had been ignored for centuries was now registering a sudden, terrifying acceleration in its collapse rate. The Council requires proof of your power, Rostova continued, her eyes blazing with a calm intensity that finally commanded the full, fearful respect of the Krillian delegates. We will offer you a demonstration, the technology that allows us to maintain perfect equilibrium against the energetic demands of our own vessel. The same architecture that repels your kinetic fire is capable of isolating and dampening loca. Lies entropic decay. We do not build weapons to destroy, we build systems to preserve. We will travel to the Great Silence and we will stabilize the collapse, proving that our purpose is preservation, not domination. This is the only way we can truly demonstrate why our strength, rooted in survival and principle, is fundamentally different from your own strength, rooted in expansion and force. The silence in the chamber was absolute. The Concordants had feared an invasion. They were now being offered salvation by the very species they had prepared to obliterate. The scope of the looming threat, something capable of unraveling the entire fabric of their known reality, dwarfed any territorial dispute. The decision to accompany the human vessel, the Steadfast, toward the Great Silence was not unanimous, but it was necessitated by the undeniable data Cathren's team had verified regarding the accelerating entropic signature. Elder Cthar, recognizing that this was the single most significant event in the known history of the Spiral Arm, committed the full prestige of the Krill hegemony and a substantial portion of the remaining defensive fleets, now repurposed as an observation and support element, to the expedition. The journey was marked by a strange, almost liturgical adherence to human protocols. The Krill warships maintained a wide, respectful berth around the Steadfast, which proceeded at a relatively modest, constant velocity, never utilizing the jarring, instant displacement techniques favored by Concordance drives. This slow, methodical pace forced the Krill's strategic command to confront the psychological impact of patience. During the transit, Rostova permitted a limited, secure channel connection between the SDI command core aboard the Steadfast and the command bridge of the Axiom of Precedence, where Cthar observed the proceedings with a mixture of dread and burgeoning respect. "Commander," Cthar transmitted, his voice lacking its prior arrogance, honed now into the timbre of a supplicant seeking clarification. "We still struggle to reconcile the inherent contradictions of your species. You possess the theoretical and technological capacity to dictate terms to the entire Spiral Arm, to render our most advanced kinetic weaponry meaningless with passive shielding. Yet you remain bound by an ethical framework that seems to inhibit you from utilizing this ultimate leverage. Why this restraint? Is it weakness disguised as morality?" Rostova, standing before a panoramic viewport showing the slow emergence of the target region, a vast, swirling area where the background radiation patterns became increasingly distorted and erratic, considered the question with careful deliberation. "Elder, you perceive restraint as a deficit. We perceive it as the ultimate expression of strength. Our history taught us that the moment a species achieves the capacity to destroy others without consequence, it gains the capacity to destroy itself through internal corruption. Power without ethical constraint is merely accelerated self-destruction. The technology you find so formidable, the metamaterial matrix, the harmonic energy manipulation, it was developed under the strict codification that it could never be used offensively. It is not a weapon, it is an environmental control system for reality itself. If we were to weaponize it, the inevitable corruption of purpose would lead us down the same path that led to the anomaly you now observe." "The anomaly?" Cthar pressed. "You speak of it as the decay of an ancient mechanism, yet we detect no recognizable propulsion signatures or structural residue. What is that which is collapsing?" "We do not know its origin entirely," Rostova admitted. "Our deep spectrum analysis suggests it is a remnant, a residual energy signature from a prior galactic-scale civilization, one that achieved absolute technological singularity. They built something vast, designed to manipulate causality on a scale that perhaps exceeded even their own understanding. They sought to impose a perfect, immutable order upon the universe. But perfect order, Elder, is antithetical to the natural state of the cosmos, which is defined by dynamic flux and the possibility of change. Their attempt to freeze causality resulted in a backlash, a monumental, contained failure. That failure is now decaying, and when it fails completely, the resulting shockwave will propagate the disorder outward. It is the ghost of an empire that tried to make reality static." The philosophical weight of this statement, that the greatest threat came not from a new aggressive power, but from the static perfection of an ancient one, resonated deeply with the Krill, whose entire political structure was devoted to enforcing an often stagnant, albeit functional, order. As they reached the geometric perimeter of the Great Silence, the sensor readings of the combined fleet went chaotic. Even the Krillian energy shielding flickered. Under the strain of interacting with the region's chaotic physics, the Steadfast, however, maintained its perfect, silent equilibrium, seeming entirely unaffected. "We are at the ingress point," Rostova announced. "Technician Jax, prepare the dampening field deployment array. Elder Cthar, we require your most powerful directional energy emitters focused on coordinates Beta 7, Delta 4, and Gamma 9. We will not be firing kinetic weapons. We require precise, stable energy injections to provide the necessary anchor points for our resonance field. The Vrelian commander aboard the support fleet, General Zorn, who had grudgingly accompanied the Krill contingent, broadcast his outrage. You require our attack weaponry merely to illuminate your stabilization field? You ask us to place our primary offensive instruments at the disposal of a species whose very presence makes our sensors fail. This is a trap. Rostova addressed Zorn with the same cool logic she had shown Thraxus. General Zorn, your kinetic weapons are irrelevant here, but your energy emitters, when perfectly synchronized, produce a highly coherent stream of manipulated photons. We need that coherence not for destruction, but as structural scaffolding. If you refuse, the entropic cascade will engulf your fleet before ours can deploy the stabilization field. Choose your interpretation. Either you aim your weapons at the locus of collapse, or you aim them at your own guaranteed annihilation. Zorn hesitated only momentarily. The cold data verifying the accelerating collapse overrode his Vrelian belligerence. He commanded his tactical officers to align their primary energy projectors with the coordinates provided by the human analyst. What followed was a cinematic ballet of unimaginable scale and precision, a demonstration of cooperation predicated not on trust, but on shared, verifiable necessity. The Steadfast, moving into the heart of the chaotic region, deployed its resonance field. It manifested not as a shield, but as a vast, nearly invisible lattice of pure harmonic energy that stretched out from the human ship, encompassing the entire focal point of the ancient collapse. The effect was instantaneous and terrifying. Where the void had been a swirling chaos of corrupted light and failing physical laws, the human field imposed order. It did not stop the collapse. It controlled the rate of collapse, forcing the energy dissipation into a slow, predictable, and ultimately manageable outflow. The sheer exertion required was evident even to the external observers. Faint, rhythmic pulses of energy bled off the edges of the human vessel's structure, the metamaterial groaning silently under the strain of holding back universal disorder. Rostova's voice returned, strained but triumphant. The cascade is contained. The outflow is now operating at a managed rate compatible with sector-standard physics. The immediate threat is mitigated. Analyst K-Thren, Commander Zorn, maintain your energy projections for another standard cycle to ensure the lattice locks onto the new equilibrium. Technician Jax will monitor the transition. For a full cycle, the combined might of the Concordance's deadliest weapon systems were utilized, not to destroy, but to support the silent, structural engineering feat performed by the small human vessel. The Krillian and Vrelian delegates watched, mesmerized, as the abstract threat they had ignored, the danger of stagnant perfection, was wrestled into submission by a species they had arrogantly labeled primitive. When the stabilization achieved a confirmed, self-sustaining equilibrium, confirmed by readings that now matched the predictable baseline physics of the surrounding void, Rostova signaled the disengagement. The Krillian energy projectors ceased their output, and the human resonance lattice slowly contracted, receding back into the hull of the Steadfast. The silence that followed was deafening. The great silence was no longer silent. It was now merely a region of slightly elevated but stable background energy, a neutralized threat. Elder Cthar's voice trembled as he addressed Rostova, now visibly exhausted but outwardly composed as she accepted a steady stream of synthesized nutrients from Technician Jax. Envoy Rostova, you have achieved what our accumulated wisdom deemed impossible. You have preserved the functional reality of the spiral arm at immense, demonstrable risk to yourselves. We acknowledge this action not as diplomacy, but as the fulfillment of a higher duty. Humanity has proven its ethical framework through the application of its unmatched power. We concede that the Sol Defense Initiative is not an aggressive entity seeking conquest, but a necessary immune response to threats we could not perceive. The Vrelian General Zorn broadcast a single, stark message. The warlord Thraxus was incorrect. Aggression is only the measure of a species that has not yet learned the true cost of its actions. We offer respect, Commander. Lyra concluded the formal acknowledgement. Vizier Lyra formally requests the establishment of a permanent, consultative alliance between the Concordance and the Sol Defense Initiative, predicated on the principle of universal stability maintenance. We wish to learn the architecture of your restraint. Rostova looked at the Krill elder, her dark eyes conveying the depth of human experience. Elder Cathar, we accept your acknowledgement. The SDI is willing to move beyond mere defense. We have stabilized the threat within the Great Silence. However, in doing so, we discovered something that supersedes even the threat of entropic decay. This was the final, unexpected twist, larger than the immediate conflict, larger than the concept of galactic order. The humans had not just neutralized a collapsing structure, they had discovered what caused the collapse. During the deployment of the resonance field, Rostova continued, displaying a final schematic, one that showed the ancient, decaying structure in microscopic detail. Technician Jax managed to isolate a segment of the originating informational matrix. This structure was not designed to impose order on the cosmos through force, as we initially believed. It was designed to contain something. The image zoomed in, revealing intricate, impossible geometry woven throughout the failing mechanism. It was a prison, built on a cosmic scale, utilizing the very physics that humanity was now adept at manipulating. The civilization that built this, Rostova explained, the solemnity of her tone matching the gravity of the revelation, did not seek ultimate power for themselves. They sought to imprison a fundamental cosmic hazard. We have neutralized the structural decay of the prison walls, but in doing so, we have stabilized the mechanism that was holding the prisoner in check, and the prisoner is waking up. The schematic highlighted a single, impossibly dense point within the lattice, a nexus of negative entropy, an anti-structure actively fighting the confinement. "What is it?" Cathar demanded, the old fear returning, far colder this time because it was alien to his established universe. "We call it the null agent," Rostova replied, her voice now carrying the weight of an ultimate species-defining burden. "It is not a species, it is a concept made manifest. It is pure, unconstrained potential, the absolute freedom from causality, capable of existing anywhere, anytime, by negating the very concept of fixed reality around it. The ancient civilization sacrificed itself to build a cage complex enough to hold it, utilizing principles we only just grasped. By stabilizing the cage, we have alerted the occupant that the lock is failing. The null agent is now beginning to probe the boundaries, not just of the Great Silence, but of the universal constants we rely upon. Our strength, Elder, was not meant to conquer the concordance. It was meant to provide a reliable, ethically sound foundation upon which we can now build the true defenses of the galaxy. The threats we face are no longer territorial disputes over habitable zones. They are threats to the very integrity of existence." She looked out at the silent, awestruck faces of the Krill, Vrel, and Cygnian representatives, now united not by fragile alliance, but by imminent shared peril. Humanity learned why we were so powerful, because we developed the ethical framework necessary to wield the power required to hold back ultimate chaos. We were dangerous because we were aware of the true danger lurking in the deep void. Now, Elder Cathar, your fleets are no longer a threat to us. They are vital components of the only defense that stands between the spiral arm and the dissolution of all things. The expansion of the concordance ends today. The preservation of reality begins now. We must work together, not as conqueror and subject, but as necessary variables in the greatest equation we have ever faced. The mission had shifted instantly. The galaxy's strongest species, humanity, revealed through its calm, principled power, had not come to demand submission, but to demand partnership in the face of an existential truth so profound it shattered the political realities of every empire present. The silent, dark vessel, the Steadfast, became the unintended beacon, illuminating the terrifying, unified frontier that lay beyond the known stars, a frontier defined by the ghost of a forgotten cosmic struggle and the slow, necessary awakening of human ethical might. The grandeur of the Krill Synod faded against the backdrop of the silent, ancient prison they now shared, united by the shared, awesome fear of true nothingness.